think of it as with the example in the elevator thing. So you were there in the elevator, someone comes in, you have a tendency to move. You have, if you wouldn't move, this is something nice and interesting Wittgenstein describes well. He discussed the Taylor Edward. If you wouldn't move, then you would feel dissatisfaction, but normally uh, uh, dissatisfaction or discomfort or something something uneasy at least. Um, and while you move and lower the satisfaction, you get to the right distance from the other persons. So the idea is that motion effect motivates immediate improvement, and the combination there's a combination of responsiveness, a responsive attitude, and normativity, in the sense of letting oneself be pulled by the object in order to improve it. Okay, this is the first one.
So I'm just not quite sure. Actually, can you go back to slide 5?
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure about the relationship between the affective experience and they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But on the next slide, you say that sort of the one immediately motivates the other. And saying that they're two sides of the same coin makes it sound like the affective experience constitutes the movement towards improving the situation.
No, they're there at the same time. If I say what you say at the next slide, then it's not correct. Which would it be?
Motivates immediately.
Yeah, but motion effect has these two aspects at the same time of yeah. I should have better said. I think motion effect motivates normative correctness, so motivates improvement. So it's three aspects here. So there's at the same time the tendency to act, the effective dissatisfaction, okay, and these two motivate or generate the improving of the object.
Well, it would be one thing to say that there's an experience of something being not right, and then much more sort of mental life structure. Whereas if you can somehow get the two together and to say that, as you do on the previous slide, that there are two sides of the same coin, that would be different. But I'm not. Seems like there's a
Okay. Now there are two sides of the same coin, and so that's the way to think about it. And the result of this coin is that things get improved, and that is observable for everybody out there in the world, seeing what's happening in a certain situation.
What's bothering him is, and I think it's so obvious to you that we don't even see it's bothering him, that there's the feeling and there's the moving.
Yeah.
And he wants to know, are they so internally and tightly related that the feeling is already a tendency to move and the moving already a sense of tension and discontent? I think that's what you're saying.
Yes. And for example, Professor Dreyfus often uses the word tension when he speaks about maximum grip. And then we tend to think at first we tend to think of tension to move, but there's also some tension in the sense of lived experience, dissatisfaction. So it's two at the same time. The tension is not only a movement, a tendency to move, but also has an effective.
Okay, or it could be better, or
Yeah.
I don't want to. Yeah, feeling I'm not going to. Just a feeling of not okay.
Yeah.
Could you say more about what an internal relation?
Mm-hmm. It's so the two constituents of the internal relation are intrinsically connected, and Wittgenstein actually I have a slide for this because I expected this question. So the two will later belong together in an intrinsic way. So this would be, think of this as the comportment of the expert or craftsman and the object. And Wittgenstein gives different examples, but the there the internal relation, it gets clear from what he describes that the internal relation is between the craftsman's expression of appreciation and the object. And another example of an internal relation he gives in philosophical investigations is the relation between the wish and the object in I should like an apple, where the object is constitutive for the liking of the apple.
But in that case, it's clear because the word an apple is used to describe the content of what it is you should like.
Yeah.
And it's the same word you use to refer to an apple. So there's literally the term you use to refer to the object desired is contained within the expression of the content of the wish. So there's clearly an internal connection. But you were talking about an internal connection between behavioral tendencies, lowering of dissatisfaction, and normative rightness of objects. It sounds like a much more explanatorily weighty
it is
conception.
It is for sure.
And I'm sure. So, for example, what do you mean to say that the behavior is internally connected to the
rightness of the object,
or to the appreciation? Say.
Okay, let me say to the rightness of the object. It is the object being appreciated as right or not right. So that would mean that the architect, on seeing the door which is not correct, immediately responds, so his behavior reflects the state of the object in a sense, because he is responding and improving, acting to improve the.
But it's not his behavior which is internally connected to the object. It's the way you're describing his behavior as a response to the object, which is connecting them. The behavior is just behavior. He's just doing something. What's the connection between it and his internal state or the object? You're describing it as if it's set up. He's responding to the object.
He's responding to the object, and if the object would have been different, then his reaction would have been different. So it's in that sense, and I know it's different from the first example of I should like an apple, of course, but on the other hand, Wittgenstein is clear that about the directedness of directed discontent, and that is an internal relation, or that directedness refers to an internal relation of the discontent to the object.
Paula was asking, why is this internal?
Because the two aspects belong together in an intrinsic way. The behavior and the object.
Wherein lies the internal?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to say that except for telling a neural story.
It's in the head.
No.
Well, it's a conceptual, semantic. I mean, as I understand it, what you're saying is this behavior cannot describe this behavior without implicating the description of that to which it is a response.
With the logical.
It's a logical connection.
Why don't you give a phenomenon? Talk about the tailor and the lapels, and then maybe they will see
The tailor and
the tailor and fixing the
yeah, okay.
lapel. Maybe then it'll become clear.
Okay, so
the acting in and the aspects, two aspects of the same thing.
yeah. So another example is the tailor at work. The tailor is working on the suit for one of his customers, and also there Wittgenstein speaks about directed discontent. The tailor is cutting and cutting, doesn't represent where he's going to with the suit. He's just Wittgenstein says he cuts it like it is, like this, because if he would cut it differently, then he would be discontented. So this way of cutting is discontented. If he would do it differently, the object would be different, and he would be discontented. Yeah.
Let me try to say. I mean, it's the discontent part. I mean, if he's discontented, Wittgenstein thinks that's tightly related to his immediate instinctive movement to cut it differently. I mean, and he wouldn't be cutting it differently if he weren't experiencing some kind of affect, and experiencing that affect is manifest in the behavior, not accidentally, but then it's in Wittgenstein, behavior isn't just behavior; it's comportment. I mean, the meaningful gesture of cutting it differently is a manifestation of this discontent. I mean, the discontent immediately leads him to cut this way, and cutting this way is directly a the expression of discontent. That's all.
But yeah,
It's gonna make it
but
literal.
the only disadvantage of I think you're on the right track, but the only disadvantage of formulating it like this, it seems as if there is the experience is like an intervening variable between the behavior and the object. But I think the idea of the motion effect is that the discontent and the behavior should be seen as going together and as a reaction to the object.
One is not the cause of the other.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe let it go on. I feel what's going to happen.
There's
to
a
you.
bunch of
Oh, there are. Okay.
Okay. I need to do some questions.
Perhaps to help clarify what you mean by there is a way of understanding how causal, root causal, cause and effect relation, linear about that.
Yeah.
And this idea of an internal relation, if I'm understanding correctly, that it's not merely conceptual to understand it as behavior, like as if we're just merely describing. That's the listed on one where the other thing has these words. Testing of the conceptual of the ontological, it's not merely logical.
I think it's very important to keep in mind that one of the things Wittgenstein wants to make clear in the same text is that it's not a matter of causality. Maybe. So, one way to explain what an internal relation is by saying it's not causal relation.
Monkeys. You can think of two monkeys that are trying to get a banana from a place. And one banana more or less deliberately, tries to grab the monkey but then the other monkey just kind of, just throw it around. And then he accidentally bumps the banana from the high place. And so to distinguish between being seeking and finding the banana, and figuring out how to get it from the cave.
Yeah, yeah. I think it makes sense, but I don't want to make too many whistles and bells on top of the internal relation music.
Bottom direction. In the case of the act, it seems like you couldn't characterize the desire without mentioning the act. But you can characterize the act without mentioning it. Whereas you couldn't characterize the behavior without mentioning the dissatisfaction. And also
Without mentioning the object.
no, right. And also you couldn't characterize the way the object is experienced without mentioning the behavior.
Yeah, but you couldn't characterize the object as being incorrect without. Now, you could, then you would have to have a different situation where there's more people, but in the situation where there's just one expert working on the object and the object, then you couldn't, then one way of characterizing the object is incorrect is by referring to the behavior. But it's not the only way. So this is more, this was the phenomenon. So then I would like to ask neuroscientists to explain me what's happening in the brain of a person in the elevator moving away in this when someone comes in. I would like to find out if brain science can shed some light on what's going on in this very brief episode where we move away in the elevator the right distance. Now, I focus on a few aspects within neuroscience, a few perspectives. The neural basis of skills, utilization, behavior, performance monitoring. Now, actually, I've been mentioning these all before, so I won't go through the list again. Very briefly, there's a whole body of literature on the neural basis of skills. Sometimes it goes on the name of procedural memory or implicit memory. The most important thing to know is that there is a widely distributed network of brain activity involved in executing a skill. And from neuroscience, it becomes quite clear which areas of the brain are particularly involved in this type of skillful motor action. I've written down the most important areas. I won't go through the list now. One question that isn't answered by these people working on the neural basis of skills is how all these areas that show up in imaging or in lesion studies, how actually the activity of all these areas is being coordinated for the realization of some task. And in order to understand how that may be the case, it's useful to study the literature on self-organization and or functional integration or neurodynamics. But I do have a story about how functional integration can occur. And one of the most important hypotheses at the moment is that it's transient global phase synchronization that makes it possible for areas to be integrated and to generate behavior at the global level. So far for the skill. Now I will pay attention to utilization behavior, but starting from first with some parts or some descriptions from Merleau-Ponty about know-how and what we could call affordances. So as you all know, he describes some concrete situations of know-how, like the woman with the feather on her head, making sure that it doesn't break, or the people in the desert immediately knowing where to go when they want to go home. Now many, when you look for it, you find quite some curriculum in phenomenology of behavior, of perception. Often it's important that this type of action occurs pre-reflectively, and it doesn't come from nowhere. The body unifies many capacities attuned to certain parts of the world, you can say. There's a direct link between the organism's capacities and what are perceived possibilities for action in the environment. However, one of the limitations, as you know, is that Merleau-Ponty's descriptions leave quite some mystery. Sometimes he speaks about how magic it all is. Neuroscience doesn't, of course, immediately shed light on this, but indirectly, I think it helps to get a better feeling for what's going on, the mechanisms. So, what would be affordances in Merleau-Ponty's pre-Gibsonian descriptions? The subject, I put here the craftsman, but actually it's about Schneider. But in this situation, I think Merleau-Ponty is also trying to describe a normal, concrete dealing with the world. So I put there the craftsman, or it should be the wall of maker. When put in front of his scissors, needle, and familiar task, does not need to look for his hands or his fingers because they are potentialities already mobilized by the perception of scissors or needle. The central end of those intentional threads, which link him to the object given. It's the piece of leather to be cut up. It's the lining to be sewn. Now, in other places, Merleau-Ponty often stresses that in familiar environments we do not deliberate, but react with movements as possibilities for action. Or, as he says, if the body stirs towards objects to be grasped, objects speak to the body subject, objects invite our reactions, objects already look attractive or repulsive before we perceive their objective qualities. It speaks of being called by the situation to do some work. But one way I like to think of the body and world is as an integrated system where the open situation can ask for some kind of work and elicit the necessary movement by some sort of remote attraction, as Merleau-Ponty calls it. So from Merleau-Ponty's descriptions, it's quite clear that familiar objects do not leave you cold, but move your do something with you in a sense. Then there is this pathology called utilization behavior, and it was described in the 1980s by Lamy, a neurologist from Perth. His patients had patients with utilization behavior in general have acquired medial frontal lesions, that is part of the brain, often acquired after a stroke, that can also be other causes. These patients tend to grasp and use objects, familiar objects, when they see them. So I could grasp and use this this thing here, by playing with it, but it's not familiar for me. But a patient may be attracted by this type of object if it is familiar to him. They even use it when they are told not to do it. And it's important that they disregard part of this of the situational context. I'll come back to that later. Finally, about the pathology, it's a transient pathology. If they recover, because some often, of course, they don't and they die, but if they recover, it's transient, and it occurs after a period of akinetic mutism, which basically means that they are without initiative and don't speak, don't move, being yeah, without initiative. That's the most sensible description. Characteristics of utilization behavior, it occurs spontaneously. These patients disregard personal concerns. So with personal concerns or also situational concerns, I mean their needs or interests or preferences. They also disregard social context or social norms. And the behavior is normally instrumentally correct. So here you see a picture of one of Lamy's patients. One example would be a patient seeing a pair of glasses laying on the table, putting it on. Well, nothing's wrong with his eyes. Then he's disregarding his personal concerns. Another thing that can go wrong is grasping the pair of glasses from the experimenter. That would be disregarding social context. And something that often also occurs is, in this case, they keep on using. So here the patient puts on 2 pairs of glasses, which is also again disregarding personal concerns, because 1 pair of glasses should be enough. Note that instrumentally correct use here means that the movement is fluent and technically adequate. He doesn't put on the glasses on the top of his head or on his shoulder, or try to put it on upside down, or just grasp the pair of glasses. It's a normal movement, and such a movement is often in neuroscience called a complex movement. It's called erections, and a full sequence of movements. So, example of utilization behavior would be taking pen and paper to write when they are laid down in the room where you are. Eating someone's apple, like these patients are often tested while doing other neuropsychological tests, and then there may be all kinds of objects in the room, and one of them may be the experimenter's apple, and the patient can grasp and use this apple, eat it. Another old example is the patient being in the house of Lamy, the neurologist, being shown through the house. On arriving in the bathroom, he sees the shaver and uses it. Another example from the same case is patient starting to undress on seeing a bed, but not his own bed. And it could also be that patient takes the first means of transportation instead of the one that goes to the right direction. So to summarize the main characteristics, behavior is instrumentally adequate, personally and socially inadequate. It's called a recursive complex action sequence. It's triggered by objects in the environment, triggered when they perceive it, when they perceive the object. Their lived experience is that the object orders the patient to use it, and importantly, they are not aware of the inappropriateness of what they are doing. And of course, we are not so much surprised that they don't have an explicit intention before they act, because we don't have an explicit intention before we sit down in a chair either. But for neuroscientists, I like to remember that it's not so strange that there's no intention beforehand. So what we can learn from utilization behavior is that familiar objects have some impact on us at the subpersonal level. There may be a link with Merleau-Ponty's descriptions of objects affecting us. But moreover, our everyday behavior is very well tuned to the complexities of the context. And there is a medial frontal system in the brain that seems to contribute to this attunement to the context. Then something about the lesions. Now, if you're not interested in neuroscience, then you may forget the areas, but for the people that I do want to mention it. The most common lesions of utilization behavior are generally bilateral lesions of the medial frontal cortex, HTC, pre-SMA, SMA, and often also interconnected subcortical structures like cardiac nucleus, and two cases are known of anterior and medial nucleus of the talon. Here a picture of the medial frontal lobe. So you look at imagine the brain is cut like this. You look at the medial side, at one of the sides. Then I don't have a pointer, but where you see all the dots in the right picture up there, that's the part of the brain that often gets damaged by in patients with utilization behavior. The areas there are the pre-SMA and the anterior cingulate, the dorsal part of the anterior cingulate. Another word for these areas that comes back later in the presentation is rostral cingulate zone, RCZ. That means the red part in the top left picture. Again, it overlaps ACC, dorsal ACC, and pre-SMA. Remember also that these areas, this is a picture of areas involved in performance monitoring. The same regions that are lesions with utilization behavior are also lesions. Now, the regions that are lesions by patients with utilization behavior are the same regions that are normally involved in performance monitoring. Okay, so there is a neural basis of performance monitoring where you see all the dots. These are studies that investigated performance monitoring. 4 aspects of performance monitoring, which are mentioned there up there. These studies point out that an important part of the brain for performance monitoring is this region.
So each one of those dots is somebody's lesion?
No, it's one study on performance monitoring.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's a review of many articles that study performance monitoring. And I just use this picture for utilization behavior to show which part of the brain is involved there. And moreover, because later on I will be talking about performance monitoring, and then that is the same part of the brain. Also, cingulate zone is also ACP. But at the moment, the latest articles on utilization behavior, they tend to focus or think out of a different frame of thinking. which is a model by Gary Goldberg from 1985, where two systems are being distinguished: the medial premotor system and the lateral premotor system. The green lines here point to areas of the lateral premotor system, and the red lines areas of the medial premotor system. One area of the medial premotor system which is not here is the ACC. That's because and also the distinction between SMA and pre-SMA wasn't made at that time. The hypothesis of the people working on utilization behavior, so these are normally neurologists doing review work, and the hypothesis is that there's a loss of inhibition, and more specifically, there's an imbalance between the medial premotor system and the lateral premotor system. The lesion in the medial system is the cause of this imbalance, and they tend to speak of a loss of internally driven motor control, and they also note that normally the medial system functions upstream and controls the lateral one. Going back to this picture, you see that both the green, so the lateral system, projects on the motor cortex, and the medial system projects on the motor cortex. So when the medial, the red part is lesioned, the green gets disinhibited. That's the picture they present. But yeah, it's not very clear what they mean with this internally driven motor control. It should be endogenous and self-regulated, that gets generated there in the medial premotor system. And one way to investigate this further is by asking why are everyday automatic actions, immediate actions, normally in line with our concerns, and why are they contextually adequate normally? And what are the neural mechanisms involved here? And another question, which I find very interesting, and which is neglected in the literature, almost neglected in the literature on utilization behavior, is how can it be that these patients are not aware that they do something inappropriate when they grasp somebody else's cup of coffee? Yeah.
In what sense do they not aware of it? Like, the guy's getting into my bed. What do you do?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. You can confront them with their behavior, and then they don't care that they did it, and they're not bothered that they did it. But you can convince them that they did something which is not appropriate. So it's not that they cannot be made to realize, but it's just that at the moment when they act, it doesn't play any role whether it's appropriate or not.
They have no directed discontent.
Directed discontent when they don't do it. That's the point. Because they're in the room and the bed, and the bed is ready to get into what they are. You said something like they feel, or they say they're ordered to do it by the object.
Yeah, that's what when you ask them, so why do you do it? They said the object ordered me to do it. But this should be more seen, I think, as a rationalization than that it's really precisely that they hear a voice from the object through their ear.
It couldn't be either. It could be a kind of description of a tendency that they feel bad there and they feel discontented there, and then the bed looks like there's a bad, they feel good over there and contented over there.
But they don't experience this inappropriateness, or they don't experience that something is wrong. They just I think the best way to understand it is by just seeing it as some attraction that occurs and that they do experience. But then when asked to describe it, they say the object ordered me. But one problem with this literature is that the phenomenological part is often not so well described, because neurologists tend to think of people like machines often, not all of them, but some of them do. So it's a bit neglected.
Yeah. argues against linear intentionality. Actually, what's missing is that when combined at a pre or a subpersonal level, it seems that make judgment as to the appropriateness of the
Okay. Um,
Why would it do that?
yeah, we spoke about personality a few classes ago, I think, and then um, I don't like the word in this context, but the way to think of it, I think, is to remember that I can call you're sitting down in a chair an automatic action, but only when I realize that it's controlled in a sense, you can stop it. It's not you doing something rigidly. If you would like to, you can stop. So um, uh, it's rational in a very limited sense of having control of what you do in normal action.
Just for example, suppose they're about to sit in a chair,
Mm.
and you say, don't sit in that chair, the chair's broken.
Mm.
Now, the way Jennifer thinks of it, they just can't stop, they just go on anyway. And the way I understood it was, sure they would stop, they're not automata, the chair won't look comfortable anymore, and it won't order them anymore.
No, but when they are told not to use the objects, they do continue using it often. But it may be when you tell them to stop, um, I wouldn't know how they would feel. I wouldn't know. It's not as fact.
More, it seems that the importance of that the pre-personal level have to go to build in. That seems that that's where the relativity comes in. You pointed out that the guidance flashes on the top of the head. He puts him without thinking on his head, and he lies in the bed, probably in canonical position instead of sideways or laterally. But then what makes him, I mean, the reason comes in at a certain place. Doesn't sound like there's an argument. When the appropriate person sees the bed, he thinks about it.
He doesn't think.
Well, no, I mean, what's the argument that bad behavior is a matter of judgment?
I don't think there isn't. I don't have an argument, but I think he doesn't think from your terminology and from others. I think there's no thinking moment going on.
What distinguishes us from the compulsive
Yeah.
and the correction of
Perhaps it is perhaps in our case, this performance monitoring system, we then again endorse this performance monitoring system does function correctly, so that we do have some control against it for months if we're not, if we don't think about it.
I think it's a valid objection that there is a correct. But one thing is this, what part would be a body subject, what engagement with intentionality, that these cases one try to imitate of the body subject. Question is how this demonstrates pervasive reflection of the relation between understanding utilization behavior, but part of the reason why I don't just grab her coffee is that I'm engaged in it right now, and it's not speaking to why I do things, but to listen to what you're saying or what the news of the monitoring you're talking about is a lack of disruption, whatever it is that you're able to be caught up in.
Yeah. Which I or another, the task is being neglected. With task, I mean here the situational concerns, the personal needs interest, and incorporated social norms. Um, yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, I just think this is connected to a discussion we've been having all semester, because I think what these people who have believed in what the results suggest is that there's really two levels of normativity involved with affordances. There's the norm of how to deal with the objects, to eat the apple as opposed to. And then there's another one of win. And it seems to me that that win norm is much richer, more complex, and really goes beyond the sort of barely perceptual in a way. And so this does, as Rick was just suggesting, I think, bear on this question of when you're fully describing foreign-related behavior and things like that.
In normal behavior.
In normal behavior, do you need to include something of that personal level?
I think so, yes. And so this instrumental correct use, as I call it, which is one level of normativity, isn't sufficient. There should also be something more, which is a broader type of normativity and takes account of the social conventions, for example.
But I guess the question is, do you think that's a distinctively perceptual norm?
I don't care about perceptual norms. It's just a norm in action. I don't know if it's distinctly perceptual. I think perception and action cannot be separated in this type of behavior.
Well, let me put it this way. Does a normal subject, when they see the bed as something that could be lied down in, they see it as something that's not to be lied down in now?
That's a phenomenological question, I think. I think they just don't lie down in it. I don't think they experience it. I don't think they experience normally a bed as not to be laying down in. Only perhaps when someone tells them go laying down in the bed, but normally it just doesn't occur to them to lay down when the situation isn't appropriate. I think.
I think that the normal people don't think about it as something to lie down in. In the same cases.
Well, I was asking whether they see it that way.
They don't see it either that way. It depends on the situation. If it's something in which we put at that moment lie down, but these patients, they only see it as something lying down.
So when a normal person is tired of bedtime, they'll have a relation to the bed with bed orders them to go to it. And the utilization of the person is just like a normal person, except that their relation to the objects isn't sensitive to the purpose of the context.
Yeah. But you receive that, you don't think that.
So then you should, if that's true, then you should be able to do brain studies that show something happening in those medial areas for the normal, when the normal is engaged in the expert task or the task appropriate to run.
The performance monitoring system, for example, should show a difference. And there may be a very small chance that that people working on neural performance monitoring in Amsterdam are going to do experiments. I really hope they will, but it's far from sure. Okay, so a bit more of the neuroscience part, please. So the part of the brain damaged by these patients is the medial frontal lobe. This part of the brain is involved in motor planning and attention, in conflict and conflict monitoring and error monitoring. The people working on that topic of monitoring, performance monitoring, there seems to be now quite some convergence of opinions that the medial frontal lobe is should be seen as a general performance monitoring system involved from various types of actions, and that it monitors in relation to what they call anticipated rewards. This is a notion that comes from reinforcement learning. I'll come back to that later. For the moment, it's important to know that this part of the brain that's lesioned in these patients is seen as the interface of cognition, motivation, autonomic arousal, and motor control, and that there are projections from this area. There are motor neurons projecting to other motor areas in the brain. One thing that I would like to call your attention to is that this part of the brain is also involved in pain functions. You can see it as like monitoring pain, and it responds to the affective distress of pain. So another part of the brain is involved in more the sensory components of pain, but this part has something to do with the unpleasantness experienced while in pain. And I want to tell a bit about that now because this may be an explanation why these patients are not aware of the inappropriateness of their actions. So this 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 dorsal ACT, this activity there is related to the felt unpleasantness of physical pain, and recently it has been shown that that it's also active and plays an important role in the experience of social pain. And an example of that would be the experience of distress that you can experience when you are excluded from a social group. And these Eisenberg and Lieberman, they did an experiment, an imaging experiment, where they put a person in a scanner and told them that they would be playing a game with other persons in two other people in two other scanners. Um, and on the left, you see a drawing of the first episodes of playing this game. It's a virtual ball tossing game, as we call it. And so first, the players are throwing to each other and also throwing to the small hand on the bottom. This is the person that is actually being scanned. And then in the second condition, at the beginning, this person gets the ball, but later on he's excluded. And then what these experiments did was trying to locate the to correlate the activity in the brain of the difference between these situations, which activity was measured in the dorsal ACT again, and they correlated with a questionnaire about the experience distress that these people experienced while being excluded. And there's quite a strong correlation between this activity in the anterior cingulate and this experience distress. And the experimenters suggest that this may be the experience of the social unpleasantness of pain. This is just the first study on this topic, so it's not. It has been replicated, but just by the same group of others. But what it suggests is that the area that gets lesions in these patients can be seen as an alarm system, and perhaps also as a first responder for title of first aid. So there's this monitoring going on there, which detects that things are going worse than expected. Then when this happens at the same time, other areas of the brain are being engaged. But moreover, there's also this self-unpleasantness that alerts the organism as a whole, or that may alert the organism as a whole. This is not that effect, it's just suggestion. And at the same time, this area, due to its motor capacities, also has the ability to give a first online reaction to what's going wrong, to contribute to making a corrective action. Let me see. I think I skipped this one. And you can ask after the next slide. Unless there's let me do one question if there's a question.
But you mentioned Schneider, and I was like, I feel like making a wallet.
Yeah.
Is it that you just stick them in the wallet, make them room, and you make a wallet?
He was very good at making wallets. He was actually his performance was not normal, but almost normal.
Yeah.
So
So what example do you want to see here?
no, it wasn't. It was more like yeah. No, he did.
But I guess my question is, what exactly makes something utilization vehicle? So if it is the case that you have
Yeah.
then you just start making wallets.
Yeah.
But ordinarily you would say flying.
No, there's there's clinical tests of utilization behavior where they put the patient in a room, let them make psychological tests,
Okay.
and at the same time there's these objects laying out on them. And if he puts on the head, then there may be, they just score the occurrences of and then they also score if it's just going around just doing like this, or if it's really a normal sequence.
Actually, the utilization being there goes. So let's say it's a guy here. You feel like you just start playing Beethoven again, it's character, or is it that you just
What again? What the problems with the simulator? There's many open questions, but I suspected that we section. So it's how far would you go? I didn't do more than just opening the piano. It was certainly start playing, but I couldn't say. First, I just opened the piano.
Since people can play the piano, so I read in their sleep, that it looks like you ought to be able to do a lot, even though you've lost the higher monitoring stuff.
well, I was wondering if a ballerina that's stuck in pirouettes. You know, how uncontrolled.
This is a bit of a strange situation because there's no visual trigger there. Yeah. Maybe the music, of course. Maybe the music.
There has to be a visual, and also an intentional.
I think the music may trigger the behavior in case of the ballerina, but this is just speculation. I mean, it doesn't make much sense. How much time have I got?
You could go on.
But how much time?
12 minutes.
Okay, so I'm afraid I won't have time to go into both screening. But anyway, I'll just finish this.
Anyway, for example, you don't understand the brain things that underlie it. Do what you can.
Yeah, no, I will finish this one because I think it's important to speak about reinforcement learning and anticipation. Partly because you write about reinforcement learning, executive reinforcement learning in your articles on maximum grip, and for example in the one on that's in Cambridge Companion. So anticipation, first a bit from Merleau-Ponty, and then some more on neural aspects of anticipation. So Merleau-Ponty writes somewhere at a very important passage actually. We are brought to the recognition of something which is an anticipation of or arrival at the objective, which means here A, and is ensured by the body itself as a motor power, a motor project, bewegungsentwurf, a motor intentionality. Now, in many places in phenomenology of perception, you see anticipation playing an important role. Students surprise it because, as I said in the beginning, when you acquire a skill, you acquire the ability to anticipate. There's also a neural basis of anticipation, and the core of it is shown in this. No, not the core, but one of the core systems involved is shown in this figure. So on top, the green. No, let me first explain the experiment. There has been done many experiments with monkeys and with humans, where they, which is a simple stimulus response experiment, where they show a light and then later on they give it juice after a fixed period of time, and in the early learning stages, which is on top and in the green, when the light is given here, then nothing happens in the part of the brain that is involved in or that contributes to anticipation. This is the upper part of the brainstem, the dopaminergic midbrain. So these graphs show activity in that part of the brain. When there is a light flash, nothing happens. But then when there is a reward delivered, in this case the juice, you see this basic increase in dopaminergic activity. This juice arrives unexpectedly, and then the monkey or the human brain activity in that area reacts to it after the arrival of this what they call reward, in this case juice. But the interesting thing is that with learning, you don't have to wait the reaction of this part of the brain doesn't wait until the juice is being delivered, but anticipates its delivery. So then, when the light is being flashed, there is already a basic increase in this dopaminergic activity, um, and that's what you see in the late training state. Blue figure there. So there's what they call back propagation. The the flashing of the light already makes triggers the reaction that normally would have been only there at the moment of arrival of the juice or the reward. Then the lower figure is when the light is flashed, but then at the moment that you've learned to expect the juice being delivered, there is no juice coming. So they call it delayed reward because it's given later. And then at that time there is this activity again. So there's the light flashes. You expect the juice to come, but it doesn't come. At that moment there is what they call negative reward prediction error. And later on, when the juice is delivered, there is another response increasing the dopaminergic activity. This is important because this type of activity contributes to reinforcement learning and contributes to building a system that is able to anticipate um, to build a system that is able to anticipate rewards. And not only rewards actually, basic to any anticipated action. So this system is called. Oh, actually, no. This what we've seen so far was the passive, just sitting there and getting the juice, or not situation. There is a more active situation where they have people choosing responses, which is called active critic reinforcement learning, which is a paradigm coming from control theory and animal decision making. Schultz is the neurobiologist working on this. The idea is that with learning, the system becomes able to anticipate future rewards. The interesting thing for us is that there's no need for any goal representation here. And that's because one part of the brain, what's called the adaptive critic, learns to predict future rewards. And the other part of the brain, the actor, learns to select better and better actions. It's being trained by the critic, and it it responds not only to a stimulus being given, but also to the activation at a certain moment in the brain. So it takes the current activation of the brain into account when it selects an action. Yeah, I'll skip this. Um, um, there's increasing neurobiological plausibility for this type of learning to occur in the brain. And so it's even more useful, I think, to read this article on reinforcement learning and maximum grip. Recently, an fMRI study has been able to dissociate these two worlds in the human brain. Before it had been done already in apes or monkeys. And it becomes more and more clear that the dopamine projections from the midbrain play an important computational role in anticipation or anticipatory behavior. So what's the effect of this basic increase in dopamine that we've seen in the colorful picture before? Actually, it occurs within about 100 milliseconds, so 1/10 or 2/10 of a second. Very rapidly enough to guide online behavior of the organism in the complex and uncertain environment. And they tend to describe it as follows: dopamine increases the likelihood that an action, a valuable action for the organism, gets chosen now because this impact is immediate, but also in the future because of the learning aspect. There's also a theory on performance monitoring that includes this work on the neural basis of rewards by Schultz, and they say that this area that gets damaged in utilization behavior and that's involved in performance monitoring um, shows now that it receives these dopaminergic projections. And when things go worse than expected, basic calls in midbrain dopaminergic activity triggers something which they call error-related negativity or oh shit potential. It's seen in imaging experiments. It's just like the same spot that you've seen before in the colorful picture. It's the same area. A rostral singleton, as they call it. It's like the alarm signal that we've seen before. It engages other areas, and perhaps for top-down control later on. But more importantly, there's also something happening immediately. So there's some immediate adjustment to the situation. Something seems to go wrong. Something goes worse than expected. And this is the moment that it may be adequate to select another possibility for action.
Are you saying that that's directed to them?
No, I'm not. I hope it will be related in some way to directed content because in the end I try to figure out what will be the mechanisms underlying it. But you cannot say it is directed content.
No, of course, but I mean, it might be.
It might be. And interesting is that so it's the same type of area, and it may be that this experience of unpleasantness or so the pain you feel when you experience something going wrong. You can call it pain. The displeasantness of it. That when this area gets damaged, also this response to the dopaminergic signal arriving doesn't occur. But it's at the moment it's just open and solved, so it's far from sure. This part of the brain is involved in value-based action selection, as they call it. So guiding decisions about which actions are worth doing based on the expected value, which takes into account the future, and this is possible thanks to the critic activity that we've seen before. And it's interesting that that the value-based action selection occurs not in just any situation, but in situations that seem to fit everyday activity very well, namely free choice situations, which can be distinguished from situations where an experimenter tells you what to do. And moreover, this activity is there when immediate action is required. So it's online directly after a change in expectations, like you would correct your behavior online immediately when your cup slips out of your hands. Now going back to utilization behavior. So now we've seen all this about performance monitoring and reinforcement learning. Can we say more about what may be the mechanism underlying utilization behavior? So the area that's used in personalized PSMA, such a lesion may increase the likelihood of the selection of an inappropriate possibility for action. The impaired monitoring of because of the lesion may lead also to less corrective action being taken. And as the same area is also involved in the unpleasantness experience with an error or with social pain, lesion there may lead to the absence of an awareness of inappropriateness, perhaps. If that is the case, then you would expect, because of the relation between physical pain and social pain, you would expect patients with utilization behavior to have some attenuated unpleasantness experience of physical pain. So that would be a way to test test it.
I'm going to ask a conceptual question while you're running through all this. So skeptics might say that you're purchasing non-deliberation and non-judgment at the personal level by just shifting it all down to the personal level. You've got monitors, you've got evaluators, you've got divines, you've got warders, you've got deciders.
Mhm.
So are you really giving a plausible
Mhm.
non-judgmental account of
Stop, give a quick answer, but
Okay,
people
the
are
way to
hearing
the way to account for that would be by means of the critic role that is able to do all this, that should be able to do all this without taking without referring to explicit goals and explicit deliberation. So that would be the way to go, like Professor Dreyfus did in his article on reinforcement learning. The actor critic model would be the way to counter it.
Thanks a lot.
Well,
How far did you almost?
yeah.